A millionaire left his wallet next to a beggar who ran away immediately, but 2 hours later, he broke down in tears at what he witnessed. Marcus Chen stood at the window of his penthouse office, staring at the glittering Seattle skyline. His reflection in the glass showed a successful man in his early 40s, immaculately tailored suit, perfectly styled hair, and an expression that betrayed the weight of memories he couldn't shake. 20 years of climbing the corporate ladder had led him to become CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. But success felt hollow in the wake of recent events. 6 months had passed since he learned about his estranged brother James's situation. The news had shattered Marcus's carefully constructed world. James, once a promising artist, had spent his final years living on the streets of Seattle, refusing help from anyone who recognized him. The guilt of not trying harder to find him, to help him, ate at Marcus daily. "Mr. Chen," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes. Marcus straightened his tie, gathering himself. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be right there." The boardroom was filled with the usual faces, executives in expensive suits, all focused on quarterly profits and market expansion. Marcus went through the motions of the meeting, presenting figures and forecasts, but his mind kept drifting to the homeless people he'd seen on his way to work. Each face reminded him of James, made him wonder about their stories. After the meeting, Marcus retreated to his office and opened his desk drawer. Inside lay a worn leather wallet, not his usual sleek designer one, but a replica of the wallet James used to carry in college. Marcus had filled it with $2,000 and his business card. It wasn't the first wallet he'd prepared this way. For weeks, he'd been conducting what he called his humanity experiments. He would leave wallets near homeless individuals, watching from a distance to see what they would do. Most had immediately sought to return them, reinforcing his growing belief that people, regardless of circumstances, were fundamentally good. But he hadn't found what he was looking for yet, though he wasn't quite sure what that was. That evening, as the office emptied, Marcus gathered his courage for another attempt. He'd seen a new face in Pioneer Square that morning, a man in a weathered coat, reading a dog-eared copy of The Great Gatsby. Something about him had caught Marcus's attention. Perhaps it was the book choice, or the careful way he turned the pages despite his worn gloves. The autumn air was crisp as Marcus left his building. Seattle's streets were quiet, with only the occasional sound of traffic and the distant whistle of a ferry crossing Elliott Bay. He walked purposefully, the wallet heavy in his pocket, rehearsing his plan. He would drop it near the man, then observe from the coffee shop across the street. Pioneer Square was bathed in the golden light of sunset when Marcus arrived. The man was still there, now huddled under a blanket, still reading by the light of a street lamp. Marcus noticed details he'd missed that morning. The man's glasses were held together with tape, and despite his circumstances, his graying beard was neatly trimmed. With practiced casualness, Marcus walked past the man, deliberately letting the wallet fall from his pocket. He continued walking for several steps, then ducked into the nearby coffee shop, positioning himself by the window. His heart pounded as he waited to see what would unfold. The man looked up from his book, noticing the wallet. He glanced around, then slowly reached for it. Marcus held his breath. Instead of pocketing it, the man stood up, looking in the direction Marcus had gone. He opened the wallet, finding the business card inside. What happened next would change everything. The man's face drained of color as he stared at the business card. His hands began to shake, and the wallet nearly slipped from his fingers. He looked around frantically, as if searching for someone, then suddenly gathered his few belongings with surprising speed. Marcus watched, puzzled, as the man stuffed his book into a worn backpack and began walking quickly. Not toward the address on the business card as others had done, but in the opposite direction. This was new. This was different. Without thinking, Marcus left the coffee shop, maintaining a discreet distance as he followed the man through Seattle's evening streets. The man's pace was urgent, his path determined. He wasn't wandering or looking for a place to hide. He was heading somewhere specific. As Marcus watched the man disappear around a corner, he felt a familiar tugging in his chest. The same feeling he'd had years ago when he'd let James walk away for the last time. Not this time, he thought. This time, he would follow. This time, he would understand. Little did Marcus know, this decision would unravel a story more personal and profound than any of his previous wallet experiments. As the last rays of sunlight painted the city in shades of amber and gold, he quickened his pace, determined not to lose sight of the mysterious man who had reacted so strangely to his business card. The chess game of life had made its opening move, and Marcus Chen was about to discover that sometimes the pieces we think we're moving are actually moving us. The streets of Seattle's First Hill neighborhood loomed ahead as Marcus maintained his careful distance from the mysterious man. The area was home to several medical centers, and as they approached Swedish Medical Center, Marcus's curiosity deepened. The man's purposeful stride hadn't faltered once, suggesting he knew exactly where he was going. Instead of entering through the main entrance, the man circled around to a side door where a nurse was taking a break. To Marcus's surprise, she greeted the homeless man with familiar warmth. "Thomas, I was wondering when you'd show up today," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "She's been asking for you." Thomas. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Could it be? He stepped closer, trying to get a better look at the man's face, now illuminated by the building's lights. The years and hardship had carved deep lines into his features, but there was something hauntingly familiar about his profile. 20 years earlier, Thomas Reynolds had been more than just Marcus's college roommate. He'd been his closest friend. The same Thomas who'd tutored Marcus through advanced calculus, who'd been the best man at Marcus's wedding, who'd mysteriously disappeared 15 years ago after a promising career as a software engineer. Marcus watched as Thomas produced the wallet, hands trembling as he spoke to the nurse. Though he couldn't hear the conversation, he saw the nurse's expression shift from confusion to surprise, then to relief. She hugged Thomas, took something from him, and hurried inside. Thomas slumped against the building's wall, sliding down until he sat on the ground. His shoulders shook in what appeared to be silent sobs. Marcus stood frozen, memories flooding back, late-night study sessions, Thomas's brilliant mind working through complex problems, his infectious laugh, his unwavering integrity. What had happened to transform his successful friend into the man before him? The question burned in Marcus's mind as he wrestled with whether to approach Thomas. Before he could decide, the side door opened again. The nurse returned, helping Thomas to his feet and leading him inside. Marcus found himself moving forward, drawn by an invisible force. He entered through the main entrance, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. At the information desk, he cleared his throat. "I'm looking for information about a patient," he said, realizing he didn't even know who he was asking about. They would be connected to Thomas Reynolds. The receptionist eyed him professionally. "Are you family?" Marcus hesitated. "I'm an old friend of Thomas's from college." "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't release any patient information without proper authorization." As Marcus turned to leave, defeated, he caught a glimpse of Thomas through a window in the pediatric wing. He was sitting beside a bed where a young girl lay, her small frame dwarfed by medical equipment. Thomas was reading to her from his worn copy of The Great Gatsby, his voice too muffled by the glass for Marcus to hear. The scene struck him with its bitter sweetness. Thomas, who had seemingly lost everything, sharing his love of literature with this child. Marcus remembered how Thomas had always said, literature had the power to transport people beyond their circumstances, to give hope when reality offered none. Moving closer to the window, Marcus could see the girl more clearly. She appeared to be around 12, with Thomas's distinctive green eyes and gentle smile. Her medical chart hung at the foot of her bed. Emily Reynolds, Thomas's daughter. The pieces began falling into place, forming a picture that made Marcus's heart ache. A nurse approached Thomas and Emily, carrying medications that Marcus recognized from the labels, expensive treatments that would strain even a middle-class family's resources, let alone someone living on the streets. The money from the wallet would cover only a fraction of what was needed. Marcus retreated to a quiet corner of the waiting room, his mind racing. The Thomas he'd known would never have abandoned his successful career without reason. The same brilliant mind that had graduated top of their class, that had helped launch 3 successful startups, was now focused solely on surviving day to day, apparently for his daughter's sake. Taking out his phone, Marcus began searching through old emails, social media, any digital breadcrumbs that might explain the past 15 years. He found Thomas's last social media post from 15 years ago, a photo of him holding a newborn Emily, his face beaming with pride. After that, nothing. As the hospital corridors grew quieter with the approaching night, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't confront Thomas directly. Not yet. First, he needed to understand the full story, to find out what had transformed his friend's life so dramatically. And more importantly, he needed to figure out how to help without wounding Thomas's pride. The wallet had been meant as a test of humanity, but it had instead become a key unlocking a door to his own past. As Marcus finally left the hospital, he realized that his experiment hadn't just revealed Thomas's character. It had forced him to question his own. Walking back to his car, Marcus pulled out his phone again, this time dialing his company's head of human resources. "Janet, I need you to look into something for me first thing tomorrow. It's about a former software engineer named Thomas Reynolds." The city lights reflected off the wet pavement as Marcus drove home, his mind filled with memories of a friendship he'd let slip away and questions about how to rebuild bridges that had been burned by time and circumstance. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his office earlier than usual. The expansive space felt different somehow, as if the discovery of Thomas had altered even the familiar geometry of his corporate sanctuary. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with fragments of memories and half-formed plans. Janet from HR was already waiting, a thick folder in her hands. "I did some digging, Mr. Chen," she said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Thomas Reynolds' employment history is interesting." Marcus leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "Tell me everything." He worked for 3 major tech companies between 2008 and 2012. Outstanding performance reviews across the board. Then in 2012, he suddenly cashed out all his stock options and resigned from his position at Oracle. After that, he practically vanishes from traditional employment records. "What about before 2012? Any signs of problems? Complaints?" Janet shook her head. "Quite the opposite. He was on a fast track to upper management. His last supervisor wrote that he was the most brilliant software architect I've ever worked with." She paused, pulling out a newspaper clipping. "But I did find something interesting from 2012. His wife, Sarah Reynolds, was featured in a medical journal article about experimental treatments for rare genetic disorders." Marcus took the article, his eyes scanning the text. The piece discussed a promising but controversial treatment for a rare genetic condition called Lambert-Charcot disease, a progressive disorder that primarily affected children. His breath caught as he read further. The treatment had been experimental, expensive, and not covered by insurance. "There's more," Janet continued. "I found records of Thomas and his wife selling their house in 2013, liquidating all their assets. They moved to a small apartment in Beacon Hill. 6 months later, Sarah's name appears on a departure record at SeaTac Airport, headed to Switzerland. She never shows up on a return flight." The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that made Marcus's chest tight. Thomas had given up everything, his career, his savings, his home, trying to save his daughter. And somewhere along the way, he'd lost his wife, too. "Thank you, Janet," Marcus said, his voice rough. "Could you do one more thing for me? Find out everything you can about current treatments for Lambert-Charcot disease. Cost estimates, success rates, leading specialists. Everything." After Janet left, Marcus walked to his window, staring at the city below. Somewhere out there, Thomas was probably already at the hospital with Emily, reading another chapter of Gatsby, trying to create moments of normalcy in a life that had spiraled far from it. Marcus's phone buzzed, a text from Sarah, his assistant. "Your 9 a.m. with the venture capital team is waiting." "Cancel it," he typed back. "Cancel everything today. Family emergency." He grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator, his mind racing. In college, Thomas had always been the one with the answers, the one who could solve any problem with enough time and coffee. Now it was Marcus's turn to be the problem solver. His first stop was Swedish Medical Center's administrative offices. The secretary looked up as he entered, ready to dismiss him, but his tailored suit and confident stride made her pause. "I'd like to speak with Dr. Harrison about establishing a charitable foundation," Marcus announced. It would focus on funding treatments for rare genetic disorders, particularly Lambert-Charcot disease. 20 minutes later, he was seated across from Dr. Sarah Harrison, the hospital's chief of pediatric medicine. She listened intently as he outlined his proposal, her expression shifting from professional interest to genuine excitement. "Mr. Chen, do you understand what you're proposing?" she asked when he finished. "A foundation of this size could fundamentally change how we approach rare disease treatment. But the initial funding required would be substantial." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Would $10 million be considered substantial?" Dr. Harrison's eyes widened slightly. "That would be more than substantial. It would be transformative." She paused, studying him. "May I ask what sparked this interest in rare genetic disorders?" Marcus had prepared for this question. "Let's just say I recently became aware of how these conditions can affect families. Not just medically, but financially, emotionally, completely." He leaned forward. "I'd like to start the paperwork today, but I have one condition. All foundation decisions must be handled with complete anonymity for the donor." As Dr. Harrison began outlining the next steps, Marcus's phone buzzed again. A text from one of his private investigators. They'd found Sarah Reynolds. She was working as a research assistant at a medical facility in Geneva, her expertise in genetic disorders apparently leading her down a different path than Thomas. Marcus felt a familiar surge of problem-solving energy, the same feeling he got before launching a new product or acquiring a promising startup. But this was different. This wasn't about market share or profit margins. This was about saving not just Emily, but maybe Thomas too. He spent the rest of the morning in meetings with lawyers, accountants, and hospital administrators. By lunch, the framework for the foundation was in place. But as he stood to leave Dr. Harrison's office, she called after him. "Mr. Chen, there's something you should know about Lambert-Charcot disease, the new treatment protocols. They're showing remarkable promise. But time is always a factor. The sooner we can begin aggressive treatment, the better the prognosis." Marcus nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Then we'll need to move quickly." He paused at the door. "One more thing. Could you tell me who Emily Reynolds' primary physician is?" Dr. Harrison checked her computer. "That would be Dr. Michael Torres. Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" "Not yet," Marcus replied. "But soon." He had one more stop to make first. He needed to visit his old college apartment building. If Thomas was still the same person he'd known all those years ago, Marcus had a hunch about where he might find him later that night. The old apartment building on University Way hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same cracked concrete steps led to the same heavy wooden door, and the same temperamental security buzzer still guarded the entrance. As twilight settled over Seattle, Marcus stood across the street, watching. Back in college, he and Thomas had spent countless nights on the building's rooftop, planning their futures under the stars. It had been their escape, their thinking spot, their sanctuary. If Thomas was anywhere tonight, Marcus was certain it would be there. He checked his watch, 8:45 p.m. Hospital visiting hours had ended 15 minutes ago. Right on cue, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the street, walking with the weighted steps of someone carrying a heavy burden. Thomas looked even more worn in the fading light, his shoulders hunched against the evening chill. Marcus waited until Thomas had climbed the fire escape before following. Each metallic clang of his expensive shoes on the rusty steps felt like an announcement, but he continued upward. As he reached the roof, he found Thomas sitting in their old spot, back against the ventilation unit, gazing at the city lights. "I thought I might find you here," Marcus said softly. Thomas didn't turn around. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out," he replied, his voice rougher than Marcus remembered. The wallet was a nice touch. "Always the one for social experiments, weren't you, Mark?" Marcus moved closer, settling down beside his old friend, maintaining a careful distance. "You recognize my name on the business card. Hard to miss. Marcus Chen, CEO of Tech Vault Solutions. Your face has been in every business magazine west of the Mississippi." Thomas finally turned to look at him, a sad smile playing at his lips. "You did it, Mark. Everything we talked about up here, the tech empire, the innovations, changing the world, you made it happen. We were supposed to do it together," Marcus replied, his throat tight. You disappeared, Tom. 15 years without a word. I tried to find you. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, you didn't. Not really. You were busy building your empire, and I had other priorities. Emily. The name hung in the air between them. Thomas's hands clenched into fists, then relaxed. How much do you know? Enough, Marcus answered. Lambert-Charcot disease, the experimental treatments. Sarah going to Switzerland. He paused. Why didn't you come to me, Tom? I could have helped. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing the rooftop. Helped? With what? Money? Like your wallet test. Some grand gesture of charity. His voice rose with each question. I didn't need charity, Mark. I needed... He stopped, running a hand through his graying hair. I needed to be the one to fix it. Emily was my responsibility. And now? Marcus asked quietly. How's that working out? The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and acrid. Thomas slumped back against the wall, all fight draining from him. She's getting worse, he whispered. The new treatments. They're showing promise, but the cost... He shook his head. I've sold everything, worked every angle. I can barely afford her basic medications, let alone the new protocol Dr. Torres wants to try. Marcus stood, joining his friend at the wall. Remember what you used to tell me up here? When I was struggling with advanced calculus and ready to give up on the whole computer science degree? A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. The solution is always there, he quoted. You just have to look at the problem from a different angle. Exactly. Marcus turned to face his friend. Let me be your different angle, Tom. Not as charity, but as repayment for all those nights you spent teaching me derivatives. As your friend. Thomas shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Mark. Maybe not. But I owe it to myself to help when I can. And to Emily. Marcus pulled out his phone, pulling up a document. I've spent the day setting up a foundation for rare genetic disorders. Complete donor anonymity. The foundation will be funding new treatment protocols at Swedish Medical Center, starting with Lambert-Charcot disease. Thomas stared at him, understanding dawning in his eyes. Mark, it's not charity, Tom. It's business. The foundation will fund research, development, and treatment. Emily would be one of many patients benefiting from the program. Nothing direct from me to you. Just a chance for your daughter to get the treatment she needs through proper channels. Tears welled in Thomas's eyes as he looked out over the city. The Seattle skyline sparkled before them, just as it had 20 years ago when they were full of dreams and plans. She loves that view, Thomas said softly. On her good days, I wheel her up to the hospital's roof garden. She says it makes her feel like she can see forever. Marcus stepped closer, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. Then let's make sure she has many more days to see it. The two men stood in silence, the weight of years and unspoken words settling between them like autumn leaves. Below, the city continued its nightly rhythm, unaware of the scene unfolding above. Two friends, reunited by chance and circumstance, beginning the delicate work of rebuilding what time had worn away. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of activity. Marcus threw himself into the foundation work with the same intensity he usually reserved for major corporate acquisitions. The board of directors was carefully selected, grant procedures were established, and applications began flowing in from families affected by rare genetic disorders. Emily's case, reviewed anonymously like all others, was among the first approved for the new treatment protocol. On a crisp Monday morning, Marcus stood outside Emily's hospital room, watching through the window as Dr. Torres explained the new treatment plan to Thomas. Emily sat upright in her bed, her green eyes bright with interest as she followed the doctor's explanation. She had her father's analytical mind, evident in the thoughtful questions she posed. Mr. Chen? Dr. Harrison appeared beside him. The foundation paperwork is complete. The first round of treatments can begin tomorrow. Marcus nodded, his attention still on the scene before him. And the prognosis? With aggressive treatment and proper support, significantly improved. The new protocol has shown remarkable results in similar cases. She paused, studying his profile. You know, it's unusual for a businessman to take such personal interest in a foundation's work. Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing it succeed, Marcus replied diplomatically. Inside the room, Emily had pulled out her worn copy of The Great Gatsby. Even from this distance, Marcus could see her enthusiastically explaining something to Dr. Torres, her hands gesturing animatedly. Thomas sat beside her, and for the first time in weeks, his smile reached his eyes. Later that afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visitor in his office. Thomas stood awkwardly in the doorway, looking out of place in his weathered clothes amid the corporate luxury. "The Foundation approved Emily's application," Thomas said without preamble. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "I heard. The Foundation's review board makes all decisions independently." "Right." Thomas shifted his weight. "We're moving into temporary housing today. The hospital's social worker arranged it. Real beds, running water. Emily's excited about having her own room again." "That's wonderful news, Tom." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out Marcus's wallet, the one that had started it all. "I believe this belongs to you." Marcus took it, feeling the worn leather beneath his fingers. "Keep it. Consider it a housewarming gift." "I can't." "You can," Marcus interrupted. "And you will. Emily needs a father who can buy her books and ice cream and whatever else 12-year-old girls need." "Your pride isn't more important than her childhood, Tom." Thomas sank into one of the office chairs, running a hand over his face. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher in college." Marcus smiled. "Speaking of which," he pressed a button on his desk phone. "Sarah, could you come in, please?" His assistant entered, carrying a laptop and a stack of papers. "Tom, TechVault Solutions is launching a new division focused on developing software for medical research facilities. We need someone who understands both the technical and human aspects of medical care. Someone who's lived it." Marcus leaned forward. "The position of technical director is open if you're interested." Thomas stared at him, mouth agape. "Mark, I haven't coded in years." "I'm not." "You're exactly what we need," Marcus cut in. "Sarah has your contract, employee benefits package, and medical insurance documents. The position includes flexible hours to accommodate Emily's treatment schedule." He held up a hand as Thomas began to protest. "This isn't charity, Tom. This is business. I need someone who understands what's at stake, who can help us create solutions that actually make a difference." Sarah placed the documents on the desk and quietly excused herself. Thomas picked up the contract, his hands trembling slightly as he read. "The salary is industry standard for the position," Marcus finished. "Take it home, review it, discuss it with Emily." "But Tom?" He waited until his friend met his eyes. "Don't let pride stop you from giving your daughter the father she deserves. One who can walk with his head held high." Thomas clutched the papers to his chest, words seemingly failing him. Finally, he managed a whisper. "Thank you." After Thomas left, Marcus stood at his window, watching his friend exit the building below. Thomas walked differently now, his shoulders straighter, his stride more purposeful. He looked more like the man Marcus remembered from college, brilliant, determined, unstoppable. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Harrison. "Emily's first treatment scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Thought you'd want to know." He smiled, remembering Emily's animated gestures as she discussed her favorite book. Perhaps he'd send her a first edition of The Great Gatsby, anonymously, of course, through the hospital's gift program. A small celebration for new beginnings. The autumn sun painted Seattle's skyscrapers in shades of gold and promise, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt the weight of his brother's memory lift slightly. Sometimes, he realized, saving someone else was the best way to save yourself. 3 weeks into his new position at TechVault Solutions, Thomas sat in his private office, surrounded by multiple monitors displaying complex code structures. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, muscle memory slowly returning as he reviewed the company's medical software architecture. The office space itself reflected the transition in his life, a blend of his past and present. His worn copy of The Great Gatsby sat beside cutting-edge technical manuals. A framed photo of Emily, taken during her better days, smiled at him from his desk. Beside it stood a small cactus, a welcome gift from the development team. A soft knock at his door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called. expecting one of his team members with questions about the project specifications. Instead, Marcus entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Still take it black with 2 sugars?" Thomas smiled, accepting the cup. Some things never change. He gestured to his screens. "The medical record system needs a complete overhaul. The current architecture is terrible," Marcus supplied, settling into a chair. "Prehistoric," Thomas corrected. "But I think I see how to fix it. We need to approach it from the patient's perspective, not just the healthcare providers. I've been thinking about Emily's experience, all the disconnected systems, the redundant paperwork." Marcus watched his friend come alive as he explained his vision, the passionate problem solver he'd known in college emerging from behind years of hardship. "How many hours have you been at this?" Thomas glanced at his watch and winced. "I should probably head to the hospital. Emily's afternoon treatment session starts in an hour." "I'll drive you," Marcus offered. "I have a meeting with Dr. Harrison about expanding the foundation's scope anyway." During the drive, Thomas stared out the window at the city streets that had so recently been his home. "It's strange," he mused. "A month ago, I was reading on those benches. Now I'm designing systems that might help others who are still there." "Speaking of reading," Marcus said carefully, "Emily received something interesting in the hospital's morning mail delivery." Thomas turned to him, eyebrow raised. "The first edition Gatsby? That was you, wasn't it?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," Marcus replied, fighting a smile. "But I heard she was quite excited about it. She hasn't put it down. The nurses say she's been reading them passages between treatments." Thomas paused, his voice softening. "She asked about you, you know. Wants to meet the person who helped make her new treatments possible." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Tom, I don't want to complicate things." "You're not." Thomas turned to face his friend fully. "You're family now, whether you like it or not. And Emily, she's a pretty good judge of character." They pulled into the hospital parking lot, and as they walked toward the entrance, Thomas added, "She's having a good day today. Just saying." The pediatric wing was quieter than usual when they arrived. Emily's room had been transformed into a literary haven. Cards and drawings from other patients decorated the walls, and her prized first edition sat carefully on her bedside table. Emily looked up as they entered, her face lighting up at the sight of her father. Then her eyes fell on Marcus, and a knowing smile spread across her face. "You're him, aren't you?" "Dad's college friend." Marcus shot Thomas a questioning look, but his friend just shrugged innocently. "I might be," Marcus replied, moving closer to her bed. "I'm Marcus." "I know," Emily grinned. "I Googled you. Did you really build your first computer in your dorm room?" "With your dad's help," Marcus admitted, though he'll never take credit for it. "That sounds like him." Emily reached for her book. "Want to hear my favorite part? Dad says it was your favorite too, back in college." Marcus settled into a chair beside her bed, something warm and unexpected blooming in his chest. "I'd love to." For the next hour, Emily's clear voice filled the room with Fitzgerald's words. She read with surprising strength, her enthusiasm for the story, evident in every carefully enunciated word. Thomas sat on the other side of her bed, periodically exchanging glances with Marcus over their shared memories of the same passages. When Dr. Torres arrived for Emily's treatment session, she was in the middle of explaining her theory about Jordan Baker's character to an thoroughly engaged Marcus. "We'll have to continue this discussion later," Marcus said, standing reluctantly. "Promise?" Emily asked, her green eyes serious. "Promise." He turned to Thomas. "Take the rest of the day off. Focus on the important things." As Marcus walked down the hospital corridor, he could hear Emily's laughter floating behind him, mixed with Thomas's deeper chuckle. The sound filled empty spaces in his heart he hadn't even known were there. His phone buzzed, another text from Sarah about urgent meetings and pending decisions. But for the first time in years, the corporate world could wait. He had a literary analysis to prepare for and a promise to keep. Back in his car, Marcus found himself smiling. The foundation had been meant to save Emily, but somehow, in ways he hadn't expected, Emily was saving them all. Marcus was reviewing quarterly reports in his office when Sarah, his assistant, rushed in without knocking, something she hadn't done in 5 years of working together. "Mr. Chen, you need to see this," she said, placing a tablet in front of him. The screen displayed an email from the genetic research facility in Geneva. As Marcus read, his coffee grew cold, forgotten. Dr. Sarah Reynolds, Emily's mother, had made a breakthrough in Lambert-Charcot disease research. Her team had developed a new treatment protocol that showed unprecedented success rates in clinical trials. And now she was coming to Seattle to present her findings at Swedish Medical Center. Marcus leaned back in his chair, mind racing. When? Her presentation is scheduled for next week. Sarah hesitated. Should I inform Mr. Reynolds? No, Marcus said quickly, then softened his tone. No, let me handle this. He found Thomas in the company's research lab, surrounded by developers as he sketched out a new patient interface design on a whiteboard. The team had taken to calling him Professor, partly in jest, partly in genuine respect for his ability to make complex systems understandable. Tom, got a minute? Thomas finished his explanation and joined Marcus in the hallway. Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. In a way, I have. Marcus handed him the tablet. She's coming here, Tom, to present her research. Thomas read the email, his face draining of color. His hand trembled slightly as he returned the tablet. Does Emily know? Not yet. Sarah's arrival is being kept quiet until the official announcement tomorrow. Marcus studied his friend's face. What do you want to do? Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Marcus recognized from their college days when a particularly challenging problem confronted them. I don't know. Emily asks about her sometimes. Why she left. Why she never visits. I've always told her that her mother was doing important work, helping other children like her. He laughed bitterly. I guess I wasn't lying. She deserves to know, Tom. I know. Thomas squared his shoulders. I'll tell her tonight, after her treatment. Will you be there? Of course. That evening, Emily was having one of her good days. The new treatments had begun showing positive results. Her energy was higher, her breathing easier. When Marcus arrived at her hospital room, she was sitting up in bed, sketching in a notebook. Marcus. She held up a detailed drawing of the Seattle skyline, complete with the Space Needle and Mount Rainier in the background. That's incredible, Marcus said, genuinely impressed. You've got your father's eye for detail. And her mother's artistic talent, Thomas added softly from the doorway. Emily's smile faltered slightly. She was perceptive enough to sense the tension in her father's voice. Dad? What's wrong? Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, taking her small hand in his. Emily, sweetheart, we need to talk about your mom. Marcus moved to leave, but Emily's voice stopped him. Please stay. As Thomas explained about Sarah's research and imminent arrival, Marcus watched Emily's face cycle through a range of emotions. Surprise, hope, anger, confusion. She gripped her father's hand tighter. Will she want to see me? Emily asked, her voice small. I don't know, sunshine, Thomas answered honestly. But whatever happens, you have people who love you right here. Me, your doctors, your nurses. He glanced at Marcus. Your extended family. Emily nodded, processing this information with a maturity that made Marcus's heart ache. Then she reached for her copy of Gatsby. Can we read for a while? All of us? They took turns reading chapters, their voices filling the room as the sun set over Seattle. When Emily finally fell asleep, the book still clutched to her chest. Thomas carefully tucked her in. In the hallway, Thomas turned to Marcus. I need a favor. Anything. Come to the presentation next week. I can't face Sarah alone. Not after everything. Marcus clasped his friend's shoulder. You don't have to face anything alone anymore. That's what family is for. Later that night, in his office, Marcus stared at the Seattle skyline that Emily had so carefully drawn. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd kept from his earlier investigation. Dr. Harrison, we need to talk about Sarah Reynolds' presentation next week. I want to make sure everyone understands that Emily's well-being comes first, no matter what breakthroughs are being presented. As he hung up, Marcus noticed a new email from Emily. She'd begun sending him daily literary analyses of Gatsby chapters. Tonight's subject line read, Why Nick Carraway Needed a Friend Like Jordan Baker. Marcus smiled, opening the email. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs weren't medical at all. They were the quiet moments of connection that healed wounds no medicine could touch. The Swedish Medical Center's conference hall buzzed with anticipation. Leading geneticists, researchers, and physicians from across the country had gathered for Sarah Reynolds' presentation. Marcus sat in the back row, watching Thomas fidget with his tie, a new one, purchased specifically for this day. "She's not coming to the presentation," Thomas whispered, glancing at the empty seat beside him. Emily decided she wasn't ready. Marcus nodded, understanding. Emily had spent the past week processing the news of her mother's return, alternating between excitement and anxiety. This morning, she'd finally made her decision. She would wait in her room, surrounded by her books and drawings, until she knew if Sarah wanted to see her. The lights dimmed, and Dr. Harrison stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Sarah Reynolds, lead researcher at the Geneva Institute for Genetic Medicine." Sarah walked onto the stage, and Thomas's breath caught audibly. She looked different from the photos in her research papers. Older, more polished, but with the same determined set to her jaw that Emily had inherited. Her presentation was flawless, filled with groundbreaking research and promising results. But Marcus wasn't watching her. He was watching Thomas, seeing the mixture of pride, pain, and lingering love in his friend's eyes. "The new treatment protocol," Sarah was saying, "has shown an 87% improvement rate in patients under 15. With early intervention, we believe we can halt the progression of Lambert-Charcot disease entirely." Thomas's hands clenched into fists on his armrests. All those years of research, all that time away, it had produced results that might have changed Emily's life if they'd come sooner. After the presentation, as the audience filed out for the reception, Sarah's eyes finally found Thomas in the crowd. She froze, coffee cup halfway to her lips. Then her gaze shifted to Marcus, recognition flickering across her face. She'd clearly done her research before coming. "Thomas," she said softly, approaching their row, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Your research," Thomas replied, his voice carefully neutral. "It's remarkable." "It's too late though, isn't it?" Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "For Emily?" "No," Marcus interjected, standing. "It's not too late. The Foundation's treatment program has stabilized her condition. Your protocol could be the next step." Sarah's eyes widened. "Foundation? What foundation?" "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," Marcus suggested, noting the curious glances from lingering attendees. They found an empty consultation room, its large windows overlooking the hospital gardens where Emily often spent her afternoons. Sarah sank into a chair, her professional demeanor crumbling. "I couldn't stay," she said suddenly, watching her suffer, not being able to help. "I thought if I could just find the answer, make the breakthrough." "She needed her mother," Thomas said quietly. "Not a breakthrough." "I know," Sarah's voice broke. "I know that now, but I was drowning in helplessness. Every day, watching her get worse." She turned to Marcus. "Tell me about this foundation." Marcus outlined the program, watching Sarah's face as understanding dawned. "Your research could be implemented immediately. We have the infrastructure, the funding, the medical team." "And Emily?" Sarah asked, turning back to Thomas. "How is she? Why don't you ask her yourself?" Thomas's voice was gentler now. "She's upstairs, probably analyzing Chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby for the 100th time." Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Does she hate me?" "No," Thomas replied. "But she has questions. A lot of them." "We all do," Marcus added quietly. Sarah nodded, squaring her shoulders. Would you both come with me? I don't think I can do this alone." The elevator ride to Emily's floor was silent, heavy with unspoken words and years of absence. Outside Emily's room, they paused. Through the window, they could see her sitting up in bed, surrounded by books and papers, her face screwed up in concentration as she wrote. Sarah pressed a hand to the glass, tears sliding down her cheeks. "She looks so much like you, Thomas. That same focus when you're solving a problem." "She has your spirit," Thomas replied. "Your determination." Emily looked up then, sensing their presence. Her eyes met her mother's through the glass, and time seemed to stop. Then, slowly, she closed her notebook and nodded. As they entered the room, Marcus held back, watching the reunion unfold. Emily's face was a study in complex emotions: hope, hurt, love, uncertainty. Sarah approached the bed cautiously, as if her daughter might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Hi, Mom," Emily said softly. "Want to hear my theory about why Gatsby really bought that yellow car?" It was such an Emily way to break the tension, leading with literature, offering a piece of herself through stories. Sarah let out a sound between a laugh and a sob, sinking into the chair beside the bed. Marcus caught Thomas's eye and nodded toward the door. This moment belonged to them. But as they turned to leave, Emily's voice stopped them. "Stay," she said firmly. "Both of you. Family stays." And so they did, watching as mother and daughter began the delicate work of rebuilding, one chapter at a time. A month after Sarah's return, the dynamics of their unusual family continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The hospital's roof garden had become their informal gathering place, a neutral territory where the past and present could coexist peacefully. Emily sat in her wheelchair, wrapped in a warm blanket against the autumn chill, her improved strength evident in her straighter posture and brighter eyes. The combined treatments, Sarah's new protocol and the Foundation's existing program, were showing promising results. Around her, the adults in her life orbited like planets, finding their new gravitational balance. So Jordan Baker wasn't just a careless driver, Emily was explaining to Marcus, who visited during his lunch breaks. She was metaphorically driving away from traditional expectations of women in the 1920s. "An interesting interpretation," Sarah commented from her spot near the garden's railing. She had taken a temporary position at Swedish Medical Center, overseeing the implementation of her treatment protocol. "Have you considered how that relates to Daisy's character?" Thomas, who had been quietly tending to the small herb garden he'd started for Emily, looked up with a faint smile. These literary discussions had become their bridge, a way to rebuild connections through shared analysis and interpretation. "Actually," Emily began, her eyes lighting up with academic excitement, but she was interrupted by Dr. Torres arriving with her tablet. "Sorry to interrupt the book club," he said warmly, "but I have some news you'll all want to hear." The adults gathered closer as he pulled up Emily's latest test results. Sarah instinctively reached for Thomas's hand, then caught herself and pulled back. But Thomas, in a moment of grace, took her hand anyway. Some things were bigger than past hurts. "The combination of treatments is working better than we anticipated," Dr. Torres explained, showing them the charts. "The disease progression has not only halted, but we're seeing signs of improvement in previously affected areas." Emily absorbed this news with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Does this mean I can go back to school soon?" "Let's take it one step at a time," Thomas said, but his voice was full of hope. "Speaking of steps," Marcus interjected, "I have some news too." He pulled out his tablet, pulling up architectural plans. "The Foundation is funding a new pediatric research wing. We'll have state-of-the-art facilities for both treatment and research." Sarah studied the plans with professional interest. "These labs, they're exactly what we need for expanding the treatment program." "That's not all," Marcus continued. "The wing will include a library and learning center for long-term patients." "Emily, I was hoping you might help design it." Emily's face lit up. "Can we have a special section just for literary analysis? And maybe a writing workshop for patients?" "It's your project," Marcus smiled. "Whatever you think will help other kids find their voice through stories." Thomas watched this exchange with mixed emotions. His daughter was blooming. His career was back on track. Sarah was present and contributing to Emily's recovery. And Marcus had somehow become the glue holding their unconventional family together. It was more than he'd dared to hope for during those dark years on the streets. "Dad," Emily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Can we show Mom the software interface you're designing? The one that helps doctors track patient progress?" Thomas hesitated, but Sarah looked genuinely interested. "I'd love to see it," she said softly. "Your father always had a gift for making complex systems accessible." They spent the next hour on the roof, Thomas explaining his design philosophy, while Emily chimed in with suggestions from a patient's perspective. Sarah offered insights from her research experience, and Marcus occasionally added comments about implementation possibilities. As the afternoon sun bathed Seattle in golden light, Emily suddenly announced, "This is what Nick Carraway was missing." "What do you mean, sunshine?" Thomas asked. "In Gatsby, Nick was watching all these broken relationships, these people trying to recreate the past. But maybe the answer isn't in going backward. Maybe it's in building something new from the pieces you have." The adults exchanged glances, struck by the wisdom in her words. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to hide his emotion. "I think you just wrote your next essay topic." Sarah checked her watch reluctantly. "I should head back to the lab. We're processing the latest trial results." She hesitated, then added, "But maybe we could continue this discussion over dinner? All of us." The question hung in the air, full of hope and uncertainty. Emily looked at her father, then at Marcus, her eyes pleading. "I know a great Italian place," Marcus offered. "Private booth, excellent pasta, and they make a mean virgin mojito for our literary critic here." Emily grinned. "Can we dress up? I haven't had a reason to wear my nice dress since—" "Then it's settled," Thomas said, surprising himself. "Dinner and discussion. Though maybe we could talk about something other than Gatsby for one evening?" "No promises," Emily laughed, then launched into an explanation of why Italian restaurants would have been perfect settings for several key scenes in the novel. As they made their way back inside, Marcus held back, watching the family navigate their new reality. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward pauses, careful dance steps around sensitive topics, moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm the present. But there was also laughter, healing, and the kind of hope that comes from choosing to move forward together. "Mr. Chen?" Dr. Torres had lingered behind as well. "The Foundation Board is asking about expanding the program to other hospitals." Marcus nodded, already thinking of other families out there, other stories waiting to be rewritten. "Schedule a meeting for next week. I have some ideas I'd like to discuss." Above them, Seattle's skyline stretched toward the clouds, a testament to the possibility of building something new from whatever foundation life gives you. 6 months had passed since Sarah's return, and Seattle's spring brought more than just cherry blossoms to the city. The new pediatric wing was nearing completion, its modern architecture gleaming in the morning sun. Emily, now strong enough for short walks, stood at the construction site beside Marcus, reviewing the plans for the library one final time. "The reading nooks need to be cozy," she insisted, pointing to the blueprint. "When you're in treatment, sometimes you just want to curl up somewhere quiet and escape into a story." Marcus made a note on his tablet. "What about the writing workshop space? Any final thoughts?" Emily's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Dad helped me design a special software program for it. It lets kids who can't hold pens for long periods still participate in writing exercises. Mom's been testing it with some of her younger patients." The mention of her parents working together no longer carried the weight it once had. Over the months, Sarah and Thomas had found a new rhythm, their shared concern for Emily and mutual respect for each other's contributions, creating a foundation for co-parenting that worked. "Speaking of your dad," Marcus glanced at his watch, "isn't today the big presentation?" Emily nodded proudly. "The medical records system he designed is being implemented in 3 more hospitals. He's nervous, but he won't admit it." They made their way to the main hospital building, where Thomas was preparing to present his software to a group of hospital administrators. Sarah was already there, having helped integrate her research protocols into the system. She wore her lab coat over a casual outfit. She'd learned to balance her roles as researcher and mother, no longer feeling the need to maintain a strictly professional facade. "There you are," she greeted them, hugging Emily. "Ready to watch your father knock their socks off?" The presentation room was packed. Thomas stood at the podium, looking confident in his new suit, a far cry from the man who had once huddled in Pioneer Square with a worn copy of Gatsby. As he began his presentation, Emily squeezed Marcus's hand excitedly. "The current healthcare system," Thomas began, "treats medical records as data. But behind every record is a story, a human being trying to navigate one of the most challenging experiences of their life." He glanced at Emily, drawing strength from her presence. "This software was designed with those stories in mind. The presentation was a triumph. Thomas's understanding of both the technical and human aspects of healthcare resonated with the administrators. As they crowded around him afterward, eager to discuss implementation timelines, Emily tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Can we go up to the roof garden? I want to show you something." The garden had flourished under Thomas's care, becoming a sanctuary for patients and families. Emily led Marcus to a new addition, a small plaque mounted on the wall. "The James Chen Memorial Garden," Marcus read aloud, his voice catching. "Emily, when did Dad and I had it made," she explained softly. "We wanted to honor the person whose story started all of this. Your brother would be proud of what you've built here, Marcus." Marcus stared at the plaque, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Emily continued, her voice gentle. "You know what I've learned from Gatsby. Sometimes the most important dreams aren't the ones we chase, but the ones we help others achieve." Before Marcus could respond, they were joined by Thomas and Sarah. "The hospital board approved the expansion," Thomas announced. "They want to implement the system across their entire network. And the research department has agreed to coordinate with the foundation," Sarah added. "We'll be able to track treatment effectiveness in real time, adjust protocols as needed." "In English, please," Emily laughed. "Not everyone speaks medical research." The adults chuckled, and Thomas wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "It means we're helping more families, Sunshine. Just like you wanted." Emily beamed, then turned serious. "I have an announcement, too." She pulled a letter from her pocket. "My latest test results. Doctor Torres says I can start taking some classes at the hospital's education center next month." The news was met with joyful exclamations and hugs. As they celebrated, Marcus noticed how naturally they had all fallen into their roles in Emily's life. No longer awkward or uncertain, but a true family unit, unconventional as it might be. "We should celebrate," Sarah suggested. "That Italian restaurant again?" "Actually," Emily said, "I was thinking we could have dinner at our apartment. I'm feeling strong enough, and..." She hesitated. "I'd like to cook for everyone. Mom's been teaching me some recipes." The simple request, so normal, so domestic, held profound meaning for all of them. It represented not just Emily's improving health, but the healing of their family unit. "I'll bring dessert," Marcus offered, already planning to stop by Emily's favorite bakery. As they made plans for the evening, Marcus watched Emily showing her parents the garden plaque. The spring breeze carried the scent of new flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a ferry's horn sounded across Elliott Bay. Life, Marcus realized, had a way of writing stories far more complex and beautiful than any novel. And sometimes, the greatest chapters came after what you thought was the ending. The grand opening of the new pediatric wing coincided with Emily's first public speaking engagement. 1 year after Sarah's return to Seattle, the hospital buzzed with anticipation as donors, medical professionals, and families gathered in the newly completed library and learning center. Emily sat in the front row, reviewing her notes one last time. She'd grown stronger over the past months, her treatments showing consistent success. Her hair had grown longer, pulled back in a neat braid, and she wore a deep blue dress that matched her father's tie. Thomas stood nearby, pretending to check his phone, but actually watching his daughter with barely contained pride. Sarah adjusted Emily's note cards, her hands gentle and sure. "Remember, sweetie, just like we practiced." Marcus arrived just as the ceremony was about to begin, slightly out of breath. "Sorry I'm late. Had to make sure everything was perfect." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, where a covered easel stood mysteriously. Dr. Harrison opened the ceremony with a brief speech about the foundation's impact, but everyone was waiting for Emily. When she was finally introduced, the room fell silent. Emily made her way to the podium slowly but steadily without assistance. It was a small triumph that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. Sarah reached for his hand instinctively, and this time neither of them pulled away. "A year ago," Emily began, her clear voice carrying across the room, "I thought my story was already written. I was a sick girl in a hospital bed, watching life happen through a window." She paused, looking at her audience. "But what I've learned is that every story can be rewritten. Every ending can be a new beginning. She went on to describe the Learning Center's programs, the writing workshops for young patients, the virtual reality stations for children too ill to leave their beds, the family counseling services. As she spoke, Marcus watched the faces in the crowd, seeing the same hope he'd once desperate for reflected in their eyes. "And now," Emily continued, "I'd like to share something special. In literature, we talk about symbols, objects or places that represent something bigger than themselves. This learning center is more than just rooms and books. It's a symbol of what can happen when we refuse to let circumstances define us." She gestured to Marcus, who moved to the covered easel. With a flourish, he removed the cloth, revealing a large framed photograph. It showed the original wallet that had brought them all together, now bronzed and mounted on a simple plaque. Below it were engraved the words, "Sometimes the greatest wealth is the courage to begin again." This wallet, Emily explained, represents more than just a moment of kindness. It represents the choice to reach out, to trust, to believe in the possibility of change. My father made that choice when he used its contents for my medicine. My uncle Marcus made that choice when he followed his heart instead of his doubts. My mother made that choice when she devoted years to finding answers. And I make that choice every day when I decide that my story isn't finished yet. Thomas wiped his eyes discreetly as Sarah leaned against his shoulder. Marcus stood straighter, feeling the weight of his brother's memory transform into something lighter, something like peace. "In my favorite book, The Great Gatsby," Emily continued with a smile, "the green light at the end of Daisy's dock represents an unreachable dream. But sometimes the dreams we think are unreachable are actually just waiting for us to build the right bridges." She gestured around the room. "This center is our bridge. Every book, every computer, every comfortable chair represents a chance for someone to rewrite their story. And the best part? We're just getting started." The applause was thunderous. As Emily made her way back to her seat, she was stopped by families wanting to share their own stories, to thank her for giving voice to their hopes. Thomas watched in amazement as his daughter, once too weak to leave her hospital bed, now stood strong as an inspiration to others. Later, as the crowd mingled during the reception, Marcus found Thomas standing by the bronzed wallet display. "She's remarkable," Marcus said softly. "She is," Thomas agreed. "And none of this would have happened if you hadn't dropped that wallet." "If you hadn't picked it up," Marcus corrected. "We all played our parts." Sarah joined them, carrying a plate of cookies from the reception. Emily's holding court in the reading nook, explaining to a group of parents why Gatsby should be required reading for all patients. They laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Through the windows, Seattle's skyline glittered in the dusk, but the real light came from within, from the rooms full of hope they'd built together, from the bridges they'd constructed across the chasms of their past. "You know what this means," Emily called from her spot in the reading nook, surrounded by admirers. "We need to start a book club for parents, too." And in that moment, watching his newfound family laugh and plan and dream together, Marcus understood what his brother had been trying to tell him all along. Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness aren't the ones that change circumstances, but the ones that change hearts. The wallet that had started their journey hung on the wall, no longer a test of humanity, but a testament to it. And in its gleam, they could all see reflections of the people they'd become, stronger, wiser, and most importantly, together. 2 years after Marcus dropped that first wallet, he stood in his office, packing the last of his personal items into a box. The Seattle skyline, witness to so many changes, painted the room in warm afternoon light. His decision to step down as CEO of TechVault Solutions had surprised the business world, but to those who knew him best, it made perfect sense. The foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, and Marcus had chosen to dedicate himself fully to its mission. Thomas would take over as CEO. His innovative medical software systems had revolutionized patient care across the country, making him the natural choice for leadership. A knock at his door interrupted his packing. Emily stood there, now 15 and standing tall without assistance, holding a wrapped package. "Need help packing, Uncle Marcus?" she asked, using the title she'd given him months ago. "Or are you too busy being sentimental?" I'm never too busy for my favorite literary critic. He smiled. How was school today? Emily had started attending regular classes 3 months ago, though she still participated in the hospital's writing workshop as a mentor. Her own story, published in the school literary magazine, had won state recognition. We're studying The Great Gatsby in English class, she grinned. The teacher asked me to lead the discussion since I'm the resident expert. Of course she did. Marcus gestured to the package. What's that? Open it, Emily said, perching on his desk like she'd done countless times during her hospital stays. Inside was a leather-bound book. The cover read, The Wallet, A Story of Second Chances, by Emily Reynolds. Marcus opened it carefully, finding a handwritten dedication. To the 3 people who taught me that every ending can be a beginning. My father, who showed me the strength in starting over. My mother, who proved that distance doesn't diminish love. And my uncle Marcus, who learned that sometimes you have to lose your way to find your purpose. Thank you for giving me more than just a story to tell. Emily, Marcus whispered, emotion thick in his voice. Keep reading, she urged. The book was her story, their story, but told through the lens of her unique perspective. She'd woven in elements of classic literature, medical research, and personal reflection, creating something entirely new and profoundly moving. It's being published next month, she announced proudly. Mom helped me with the medical terminology, Dad helped with the structure, and you, well, you gave me the story in the first place. Marcus hugged her tightly, remembering the frail girl in the hospital bed who had found strength in stories. Now she was writing her own. A commotion at the door drew their attention. Thomas and Sarah arrived together, carrying champagne and glasses. We thought this called for a celebration, Sarah said, holding up the bottles. Sparkling cider for our author, of course. As they poured the drinks, Marcus looked at his assembled family. Thomas, confident and purposeful, so far from the man who had once huddled on street corners. Sarah, who had found a way to balance her research with motherhood, now leading the Foundation's International Research Division. And Emily, their miracle, their bridge, their storyteller. A toast, Thomas proposed, raising his glass. To new chapters. To family, Sarah added. To stories yet to be written, Emily chimed in. Marcus raised his own glass, thinking of his brother James. To the hands that guide us home. They clinked glasses as the sun set over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of possibility. Below, construction had begun on 3 new pediatric centers, each designed with Emily's reading nooks and writing spaces. The Foundation's model had attracted international attention, proving that sometimes the greatest innovations come from the heart rather than the laboratory. You know, Emily mused, looking out at the city. Gatsby got it wrong. You can't repeat the past, but you can build a future that makes sense of it. Is that going in your next book? Marcus asked. Emily smiled mysteriously. Maybe. I'm thinking of writing about a girl who starts a revolution through storytelling. Want to help me brainstorm? Always, Marcus replied, realizing that some promises were easy to keep. Later that evening, they gathered at Thomas and Sarah's apartment. A spacious place with room for Emily's growing library and a guest room that had somehow become Marcus's second home. As they shared a meal together, their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and literary references. Emily had insisted on cooking again, proving that some traditions were worth keeping. As she served her signature pasta dish, Marcus watched his family, the one he'd found through an act of questioning humanity and found humanity instead. The wallet that started it all still hung in the pediatric center, its bronze surface catching the light. But the real treasure wasn't in the wallet, or even in the foundation it had inspired. It was in the stories it had brought together, in the lives it had transformed, in the love it had unveiled. And as Seattle's lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Marcus realized that some experiments yield results far beyond their original hypothesis. Sometimes they yield miracles. So, Emily announced, bringing dessert to the table, I've been thinking about my next project. What if we started a foundation scholarship for aspiring writers dealing with chronic illness? And just like that, they were off again, planning and dreaming and building. Because that's what families do. They write their stories together, one page at a time, forever after.